All right, I've never watched this debate from William Lane Craig. I watched most of his debates, but not this one. I'm going to give a live breakdown of it. So let's make this smaller. That should be good.
All right.
Easy on me.
So I get to play the prosecuting attorney here. I'd like to begin with my 5 arguments, and then we can end, if I have time, on your 3 arguments. I noticed that you have not replied yet to my fine-tuning argument, to the argument on the resurrection of Jesus, and to the appeal to immediate experience. Is that right? Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about your reply to the origin of the universe argument, the cosmological argument. I gave 2 arguments for the second premise that the universe began to exist. One was a philosophical argument, and one was a scientific argument. Now, you haven't responded yet to my philosophical argument. Is that right?
Remind me what that was.
That was the one based on the impossibility of the existence of an actual infinite. Remember the infinite number of things in your sister's basement?
Actually, it wasn't junk in my sister's basement. It was my books.
Your books,
Yeah.
okay.
And I do have an infinite number of books.
You do?
See, there's...
Where in the world do you put them?
She's got a large basement.
Yeah, an infinite number of books, of course, would occupy an infinite amount of space, which would have interesting...
So that's interesting. Craig usually uses an example like Hilbert's Hotel, but that's another good example I haven't heard yet. Infinite amount of books. Where would you put the books? It would fill an infinite amount of space, but that's impossible.
Cosmological implications. Well, I would be interested in hearing how you would respond to the argument against the existence of the actual infinite, if you can do that in your next speech. Let me go on to what you did say about the Big Bang Theory. Here you suggested that I wasn't expert in the area, and that therefore you were dubious of what I was saying. Now, you would agree that Alexander Vilenkin is expert in this area, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think he expertly disagrees with you.
Well, Vilenkin was the gentleman I quoted in my first speech who said, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Now, do you think Professor Vilenkin, who's an eminent cosmologist at Tufts University, is mistaken in what he says here?
Well, you know, I can only fall back on the problems that I have is I'm not really qualified to talk as a physicist. The truth of the matter is that they could say anything to me, and I think I'd pretty much accept it. The problem I raised there is not so much as your expertise. I actually don't know very much about it. I'm guessing a degree in theology doesn't really give you a good grounding in physics, though I'm sure you can read as widely as you like in the area. My concern is that it seems to me that physicists are actually doing research that kind of presupposes that the way you've laid out the absolute beginning of the universe, its creation out of nothing, can't possibly be correct.
Well, let's talk about that then.
Okay, so he raises a good point there. Neither of them are cosmologists or physicists, but he just made an appeal to it. So he's kind of playing both sides here. If you're going to say that we're not experts in this field, therefore we can't make a point on it, then it becomes nil. It becomes, well, maybe. That's it. You can't then turn around and say, oh, well, it seems like they're pointing towards, it's not actually a beginning. Because then you're doing the same thing you just criticized Craig for.
You quoted, for example, Paul Steinhardt and Neil Turok's work on ekpyrotic cyclical models. Isn't it the case that Alexander Vilenkin, with Alan Guth and Arvind Borde, developed this theorem for the past finitude of the universe, specifically in an application to Steinhardt's model, showing that it cannot be infinite in the past?
I'd have to beg off on that.
Well, take a look at Paul Steinhardt's website, where I think you'll find this admitted. And as for Alan Guth, you mentioned his work on inflationary cosmology. This theorem that I quoted was developed by Alan Guth, along with Arvind Borde and Alexander Vilenkin. So that Guth himself says inflationary models cannot be extended into the infinite past. So why do they continue doing research on that? Well, let me ask you this. Isn't it the case that we have not yet discovered a quantum theory of gravity, a theory that would unify the four forces of nature into a quantum gravity theory?
That's true.
And so wouldn't this be an incentive to pursue further research?
Sure.
And wouldn't it also be the case that when a scientist proposes a theory, he will list conditions that would serve to falsify that theory in hopes that those experiments would fail and thereby corroborate his theory? So isn't it the case that theorists who believe that the universe had a beginning will continue to pursue research aimed at attempting to falsify their models?
That'd be a good idea.
Okay. Let's talk about objective moral values.
All right, so thank God we're switching, because that was a bunch of cosmology, science, this, that, and the third, but it's important stuff. I think that this is only Craig's cross-examination, so I'm going to find Williamson's examination of Craig after this, but he's going to go over more about this. Should be interesting.
You made some vague comments here, but I'm not sure where you stand yet, Dr. Williamson. I would agree with you when you said that we can all agree on something, and that's not objective. I defined objective to mean valid and binding whether anybody believes in it or not. For example, to say the Holocaust was objectively wrong would be to say that even if the Nazis had won World War II and brainwashed or exterminated everybody who disagreed with them, it would still have been wrong, even if nobody held that. Now, would you agree that if God doesn't exist, then moral values aren't objective in that way?
That's what I'm lacking, is I don't see what your argument is between God's existence and the existence of objective values.
Well, then let me put the question a different way. You said we have another source for morality. If God does not exist, if God is dead, as Nietzsche said, then what other source for objective moral values is there that would stave off the kind of moral nihilism that Nietzsche predicted?
Well, my suggestion there, well, let me try and put it this way. I was interested in what you wanted to give us in the way of a demonstration that there actually is an objective morality out there. And it seems to me you relied on something that was effectively consensus. Now, how do we know from all of the beliefs about morality that human beings actually hold, what ones are actually independent of their holding those?
All right, now what I hear you saying now is that it sounds to me like you are skeptical that objective moral values exist.
What I'm asking is, it seems to me that the claim that objective morality exists deserves some kind of an account that would actually meet your definition.
But I would like to know what you...
See, that's a bit different from what he asked. So what he asks is, if there are objective moral values, where could they have come from? Now, he's saying here he's suggesting that there are no objective moral values, which is a way of sidestepping the moral argument.
You think, I mean, which of these two premises do you disagree with if you disagree with the conclusion? Which premise is false?
Well, I think the trouble is that's going to take us far afield. But I would say I accept an objective morality. The trouble is, I think I would want to put some constraints on what objectivity means. It seems to me objectivity is perfectly good as an idea of consensus within human societies.
Okay.
That doesn't make sense. Because, okay, we're going to have to break this down. It's a bit technical. Should I write this? Okay, I'm going to note that out. Alright, so what he basically just said was, because this is the moral argument. Objective values to objective. This is objective values. Wait, no, it's what's the whatever. Basically, the whole point is if objective values exist, that's basically the point being made here. So it doesn't really matter. Like, this is not an argument about what is objective and what's not objective, what is actually right or wrong. It's just about whether or not, because it says objective values exist. Okay, so what binds them? That's the question here. It's not necessarily about what specific values. It's not the point here. One moment. Alright, so we're going to go over Williamson's cross-examination. I believe this is in order.
Okay. Well, Dr. Craig, I'd like to start out by asking, you're suggesting that the actual infinite universe would be an impossibility. And I believe you've brought up Hilbert's Hotel as an example there. Could you run us through Hilbert's Hotel?
Sure. I didn't bring that up tonight, but I'd be happy to. I do in my work. David Hilbert, whom I quoted in the first speech, wanted to illustrate what it would be like if an actually infinite number of things could exist. And so he said, let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose that every room is occupied. This is absolutely critical to understand. There is no vacancy in the hotel. There's a person in every room. Now he says, let's suppose somebody shows up at the desk asking for a room. The proprietor says, no problem. And he moves the person in room 1 into room 2. The person in room 2 into room 3, the person in room 3 into room 4 on out to infinity, and as a result, the first room becomes vacant and the new guest easily checks in. But before he arrived, all the rooms were full. Suppose an infinite number of new guests show up at the hotel, and again, every room is already occupied. No problem, says the proprietor. And he shifts the guest in room 1 into room 2, the guest in room 2 into room 4, the guest in room 3 into room 6. He puts every guest in the room number double his own. Well, since any number times 2 is always an even number, all of the even-numbered rooms become occupied, all of the odd-numbered rooms are vacant, and the infinity of new guests check in, even though there was no vacancy in the hotel. Well, I agree with Hilbert. Such a hotel is absurd. This is a mathematical thought experiment that could not possibly be instantiated in reality. And so this would just be one of the illustrations that one might use to show the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things.
Okay. So the issue is the question of how we can understand obvious operations that should arrive us with a bigger sum than the one that we previously had.
Well, I wouldn't put it so abstractly. I would want to say, how can you have a hotel that is absolutely fully occupied and yet can accommodate infinite numbers of new people just by moving people around? That to me strikes me as absurd.
Well, I guess I'd want to suggest that there's two different senses to bigger than that seem to be working in there. One is a numerical sense.
Is that a juice box? I just noticed that.
In which one set simply has a number of members greater than another. And another sense of bigger than in which any proper part of a whole, the whole is always bigger than the proper part. Now, I think these two different...
Did you say is bigger or is the same as the proper part?
Is bigger, sorry.
Okay.
The whole's bigger than the proper part.
Though with infinites, that fails.
Exactly.
The proper part has the same number of members as the whole.
Yeah, and that's why it's typically held that the numerical sense of bigger than would be the only one that really applies to the notion of infinity.
Yeah.
Now, does this...
Right, and that gets you hotels like Hilbert's Hotel, which to me seems crazy.
Does this prove any more than there's some odd implications of talking about infinity?
Well, I think that is a good response. You could just say that just shows the infinite is bizarre, but I think that there...
See, that's basically the only thing you can respond with if you want to say that actual infinites do exist. You could just say, well, the infinite's odd.
There comes a point at which one's credulity is stretched to the breaking point, and one says, this is mad. And I think that especially comes when you begin to subtract. And that was why I mentioned in my opening speech, subtracting infinity from infinity. Just very quickly, suppose all the odd-numbered guests check out of the hotel. In that case, an infinite number of people has left the hotel, and yet an infinite number still remain, all the even-numbered guests. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead all the guests in the rooms greater than 3 check out. In this case, There are only 3 people left in the hotel. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet in both cases, the same number of people checked out from the same number of people. You have identical quantities minus identical quantities, and you get self-contradictory answers. In fact, you can get any answer from 0 to infinity. And I think, again, what this shows is that these are mere mathematical tricks that cannot be descriptive of the real world because self-contradictions don't come true.
Okay. I'd sort of also like to go back to the topic of quantum physics, the origin of the Big Bang, and all that sort of stuff. Hey, look, you know, you obviously know much more about the subject than I do, but I'm still puzzled. Why do people like Quentin Smith say that other people disagree with you?
Well, now, Quentin is a dear friend of mine. He's at the University of Western Michigan. We co-wrote a book called Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. And Quentin is an ardent atheist. He will do anything to avoid the existence of God. And he himself admits in his writing, like the book I mentioned, that the universe did begin to exist. He agrees with me that the universe began to exist. But in our book, he says, if I can quote him accurately, the most reasonable position is that the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Now, to me, that is the height of irrationality. But he doesn't disagree with me on the second premise, that the universe began to exist. And the people you mentioned, Guth, Steinhardt, and so forth, have already explained that this theorem that was developed in 2003 applies to their models.
Okay.
So you're right, I'm not a cosmologist, but I did do my doctoral work in the cosmological argument, which took me into cosmology as an avocation, and I try to confer with people like Vilenkin and Donald Page at the University of Alberta and so forth to keep abreast of developments in the field.
Okay. One last question, because I think I'm pretty much out of time here. If an objective morality exists, where are you finding it? I mean, where do you find the list of moral commandments?
That is an epistemological question, not an ontological question. What I mean by that, for those who aren't familiar with the terms, that's a question about how we come to know our moral principles. How do we come to a knowledge of moral principles? My concern is the question of the foundations of morality. What is their ontological foundation? Now, I'm quite open to any epistemological approaches to our knowledge of moral values that you might want to suggest. Intuition, natural law, ethics, divine revelation. I'm open to all sorts of epistemological paths to our knowledge of the good. But my interest here is not with moral epistemology, but with moral ontology. What's the foundation for moral values? So any epistemological approach to morality that you'd like to propose, I can second that. I can be quite enthusiastic about it.
Certainly not as good as the Hitchens-Craig cross-examination or a few of the other cross-examinations I've seen, but interesting to see the point about objective moral values and some stuff about cosmology and quantum physics, blah, 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 all this nerd stuff. It was okay. It was all right.